I just watched Band of Brothers. This is a member request from Bear the Dog. He used 2 months of member request for this because it's a 10-hour show. And I know him in real life. So he's been pushing me for years to watch this. I kept putting it off. And now he's exploited my channel. But really, this is a really good show. I can see why it's so popular. I've only heard good things about it. It's a show that gets a lot of things right. And the way that it's structured, I think, is really interesting. Essentially, you're following around Easy Company from D-Day to the end of the war. Obviously, World War II. But each episode, loosely, focuses primarily on one person, but most of the characters are in every episode, or almost every episode. So you're kind of getting a different perspective of each character throughout the war, and then obviously the war is going chronologically as well. Also, every episode begins with the real guys talking about their experience related to that specific episode. But they don't say their names until the very end. So you don't know, obviously, who survived or who didn't, unless you cheat and look it up. And then at the end of the episode, you get like a couple little captions kind of summing up what happened and sort of the viewpoint of that event, historically speaking. If I had a major criticism for the show, it would be that it relies heavily on you knowing that it's real or based on real people, based on real events. Maybe that's not a fair criticism because obviously if it was fictional, they probably would have structured the story in a different way. But for instance, you don't really get much about the characters' backgrounds beyond where they're from. There's not really like a one big narrative arc or anything because it's based on real people. And it seems like they stuck pretty true to it from what I read online. They did change some things from what I saw. Like some of the deaths and stuff were definitely different. And that's why I said maybe it's not really a fair criticism because it is based on real events and real people. And they use that to their advantage by reminding you every episode, like, hey, these are the actual guys it was based on. All the fighting is super grounded. There's actually not like a ton of violence and gore, but the show uses it very effectively in a way that makes it not hard to watch in a bad way, but hard to watch in the way that any war movie or show is. So that's why I said maybe it's not really a fair criticism because it is based on real people. You know, how much do you want them to embellish and modify stuff? I don't know. I just wanted to point it out because just from a purely story perspective, it is worth mentioning that the fact that they're real people and it reminds you every episode, and obviously all the events are real and you know that, you're very cognizant of it, do a lot of the legwork for the show, emotionally speaking. It's got a massive cast. You get appearances from James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, Tom Hardy, who looks super young, David Schwimmer, a bunch of people you'll recognize even if you don't know their names. Even one of the main guys is the guy who voices Steve Smith in American Dad. The guy on screen right now is the internal affairs investigator in Justified. There's a whole bunch more you'll definitely recognize if you watch it. But let's get into it. I'm just going to go quickly through each episode because there's 10 and kind of just talk about what I liked in each one mainly. So the main character for the show is Richard Winters, I would say. But the primary focus of episode 1 is Captain Sobel, who's played by David Schwimmer. And he's interesting because if you watch the little preview on Netflix, he's a total asshole, kind of drill instructor, sergeant guy for the paratroopers. But then what you find out through the episode is that as soon as you get into a combat situation, he kind of folds. And this is something that's really interesting throughout the show, is all the different ranges of how people deal with the situation and just really the tragedy of the war that they're involved in. And he's one of the first ones that you see just crack under the pressure. And he actually does end up getting kind of promoted throughout the season, but you don't really see him because he's back in America on a base where he's doing a job that he's good at. And combat is just not what he's good at. And then there's obviously kind of a commentary on leadership there. And this is something you see throughout the show, that there's people who get put into leadership positions who have the skill set to get there, but not actually lead. You have a guy like him who's a good leader in certain circumstances. You have guys that are put in leadership positions due to nepotism who just have no business being there. So it's a pretty interesting start to the show to see this guy who's a total asshole, really good at his job, but then in a different environment, he just can't operate. And I also wanted to mention the structure of the story and the way that it's written, because I do find it interesting. I do find it interesting that he used a very traditional structure. And I'm sure most people don't care about this, so you can just skip ahead if you want by 30 seconds. I'm going to talk about it anyway. So the 3-act structure is like obviously the most basic structure. That's the one you hear about 95% of the time with storytelling. But there's a guy, Hagee, I can't remember, who broke it into 6 phases within the 3 structures. So each act has 2 phases. And this helps you, if you're writing, get like a proportional breakdown of where you should be at in your story based on the length and just if you're rigidly sticking to this structure. So the first stage is the setup, which is 10%. And this show is 10 episodes, uses episode 1 for this first 10% to set up the story. This is where they go through boot camp and you see them getting ready for war. And it ends with them going into D-Day. The last episode is kind of the aftermath of everything. And this is where the story is pretty much wrapped up. But you see, where they end up, what happens. It kind of ties up all the loose ends. And this is also the last 10%. The second phase, or stage 2, is where the situation changes. And this takes you from about 10% to roughly 25%. So then the next 2 episodes in the show are D-Day, things go crazy. They think they're done, they get sent back. And then all of a sudden for episode 4, they get called back. And this is your 25 to 50% roughly. For the show, it'd be more like 30 to 50. And this is where they really become hard veterans. Because they just keep fighting, they keep getting sent back. Then your halfway point, which is where you get stage 4, is where things get complicated. So this is usually, standard speaking, 50 to 75%. I would say for this show, it's probably 50 to 80 because you get episodes 6, 7, and 8. And this is where things go sideways. You see how bad everything is. Episode 7 in particular ends on a super downer note. And then you have episode 9, which would be stage 5. And this is your 75 to 90, 95. For this show, more like 80 to 90. And this is where they go through the final push to end the war. Obviously the war ends and then you get episode 10, like I said, the final stage. So I just thought it was really interesting how almost rigidly this show sticks to a traditional storytelling structure and how well received it is. That it used the entire first episode for setup, used the entire final episode for conclusions, and it seems like everyone loves it. Because a lot of shows you'll see try to really rush the setup in the first 5 minutes or really wrap up the conclusions in the last 10 minutes of a 10-hour show. So you just run out of time to tie up all the loose ends. Episode 2 focuses primarily on Richard Winters. And the D-Day scene in this is crazy. Like the initial scene where they're leaving the planes and they're all jumping out and there's just fire everywhere and ships are getting shot down. It really gives you, I think, a pretty fair look at what it's probably like, and also a lot of appreciation for how crazy and or brave these people are who go into these situations. And Winters leads them and takes over these trenches. Multiple people die, obviously. Some people just get lucky and have grenades laying near them that are either duds or they just don't get hurt. And this show really does a good job of showing how much of war is just luck, good or bad. People getting shot by their own men accidentally. Maybe they're just running a routine errand and all of a sudden get hit with a bomb. It's pretty crazy how much of a factor luck is in surviving this kind of environment. And also, it shows some really brutal things, not even on screen necessarily, just where, a guy found out his brother died right before battle, and instead of taking all the Germans as POWs, he just mows them down, disobeys orders. You have a guy who's like, why are we taking all these prisoners? Again, just executes them. Like, pretty crazy stuff to see how people react to this kind of just unimaginable environment that these guys were in. Episode 3, I would say, focuses mostly on Blythe. And he's a guy who's just kind of getting overwhelmed by the war. And he's actually one who they changed his death in real life. But they take over this little town, and it's just absolute chaos. And something this show really does that's smart, that I am glad they did it, is that there's no music for like any of the fighting. It's just gunfire, explosions, people yelling, and that's it. So it really feels like you're in there. And you can tell in spots it's a little bit low budget, where they do kind of the thing that the Halo show did, where they just zoom in on them shooting and you can't really see what they're shooting at. Of course, Halo doesn't even belong in the same breath of this show, the same breath as this show quality-wise. And this is a much more grounded show. And something else they do a really good job of is showing maps the whole time. So you're seeing like, okay, they're here, they're heading here. It's very easy to orient yourself within the battle from their perspective. So they did a lot of things right, besides just the show being hard to watch because it's based on real people. And the show does a really good job too of just making you feel how miserable the situation is when they're just in this foxhole forever and ever, days or weeks at a time, or whatever the case may be, that they're just grinding it out and eating terrible food and sleeping in places that you don't want to sleep in. Like, they're used to the background noise of just gunfire and explosions. It really puts you in there. This episode focuses mostly on Bull, who's played by the guy who plays Abraham in Walking Dead. And they have this pretty crazy fight, and he gets left behind. And he ends up having to hide and survive and fight his way out. And this is like one of those things where I was talking about how they don't use a ton of gore, but the deaths are brutal because him and this guy are just close quarters. There's no gunshots, just man to man with knives and bayonets. It's really rough to watch, even though it's just a one-on-one fight in a barn. And there's also some really interesting stuff that starts here where you start to see, because so many people are dying, that you're just getting new faces in their unit over and over and over, and they just keep dying. And there's kind of a disdain for the new faces because they're all fresh and kind of doe-eyed, while these guys have been fighting just non-stop, seemingly for months on end. There's also a part in here where they're in Holland, and the women are all kind of going after the soldiers. And then we see a bunch of women get punished because they slept with the German soldiers, presumably to try to protect themselves. It's really hard for me to honestly even imagine like a situation where you would be welcoming foreign soldiers because they're coming to protect you. But I guess as Americans, we have that luxury. This episode, I would say, focuses again on mainly Winters. And we see him get promoted to head of division or whatever. And then he gets stuck behind a desk. And it's just really interesting to see that he is frustrated, because this is one of those things that applies to every job. But I wonder if it would be worse in the military, where, if you want to become whatever your job is, an accountant, engineer, construction worker, whatever it is, once you start getting promoted and moving up, you kind of end up getting further away from the thing that got you into that position. And we see that here, where he's getting further from the fighting. They're kind of looking for his replacement. And now he's sitting behind a desk writing up reports. And you can tell he's irritated His friends are kind of making fun of him, but he's a good leader, and that's kind of his reward. And we also get a little bit of stuff here with PTSD, where it's really starting to hit these guys. Like Winter gets some time off, and he's having these flashbacks about stuff that he's done. And then his friend Compton here, also a very famous actor, got shot in the ass. And they're watching a movie, but you can tell he's pretty shaken up. Even though he's not directly saying it, it's very obvious that it's affected him more than he's letting on, or trying to let on at least. Episode 6, called Bastogne, is maybe my favorite one because this is the perspective of the medic, Eugene, but also the situation that they're in is just crazy. So they're just stuck in the winter in Bastogne, and they're just completely surrounded just for days on end. They're just constantly getting shelled. They have a guy walk past their line because they're so spread out to take a shit. He doesn't even see them. But I really like this episode because you get to see it from the medic's perspective. And the whole episode, he's just low on supplies. He's frustrated. He kind of connects with this French nurse who's attractive. So obviously you know where that's going to go. And, you know, they're both just kind of frustrated because it's like they're doing what they can, but it just feels like everyone is dying. And I just think it's really interesting to see that the frustration isn't just from the fighting, isn't just from the lack of sleep. It's the cold, it's the dying, they're losing everyone. It's just kind of this slow grind into mental exhaustion. They don't have any winter coats. They don't have like any winter gear. They're just stuck out there in foxholes, kind of trying to cover up for warmth. They can't make fires because they might get bombed. It's just a really good episode. And at this point, you're just over the halfway mark. And I feel like this episode and the next one combined really show like kind of the toll that the war takes on all these guys after being there for so long. Episode 7 is another really good one. And this one focuses mainly on Lipton, who's played by Donnie Wahlberg. And he's like a sergeant or staff sergeant or whatever. But the lieutenant is a guy who came from Yale or some shit and has connections. So he got put in charge, and then he just kind of wanders off because he doesn't want to deal with the responsibility. And there's some good humor here in too. There's some good humor in here too, where the one guy's bitching because he's like, I'm going to kill somebody. They shit in my foxhole. And just some random jokes like that kind of got you chuckling at appropriate times. Not like during the fighting typically. But yeah, his perspective is interesting because he's frustrated with the leadership. But obviously the military is a very rigid hierarchy. There's not really questioning orders or second guessing everything. And this is also where we see a couple of guys that we've been with all season get their legs blown off. And Compton sees them, and that's kind of it for him mentally. Which is crazy to think that somebody who's been out here in this war, obviously brutal for months, seen all kinds of people die, seen all kinds of limbs cut off, and who knows what. But when it's a couple of his friends, it ends up just being enough, and he just can't do it anymore. And that ends up being kind of the impetus for him leaving. So that's what I'm saying, is it does a good job of being emotional, like especially those moments. But you do have to wonder how much of it is because of the show and how much of it is just because you know that that's what actually happened. And there's also some really good scenes in here too where there's just bombs falling everywhere and they're all just sitting in their foxhole essentially praying they don't get hit because they can't do anything else. And again, just kind of reinforcing how lucky or unlucky war really is for the individuals, at least. Episode 8 is a really interesting one because we follow Webster, who got hurt earlier before Bastogne and then came back. And then he gets kind of treated as an outcast because he missed essentially some of the toughest fighting and the most deaths and that sort of thing. And then we also get quite a bit of it from Tom Hanks' son, who plays a recent West Point graduate who wants some action. But then you also have the dynamic of he wants to do stuff, and he's like technically the superior officer to a lot of people, but at the same time, he starts out higher because he went to college, and the guys out here have been fighting, so it's kind of like get fucked. And this is also something you'll see in real life, well, in regular jobs all the time as well. I've experienced it myself. My background is geophysics, and I'm an engineer now. But when you go work on an oil rig or a construction site or whatever, you show up with a college degree, and you're technically people's superior, but they've been doing the job longer than you've been alive. So a lot of them kind of resent you for that dynamic. And then I've never tried to enforce it, but if you do, they absolutely treat you like shit. There's also something really interesting in episode 8 for Winter's character, where a big part of the episode is they had to sneak across the river, capture some Germans to get intelligence out of them, and then sneak back with the Germans in tow. And they do it. They send 15 men. None of the guys want to do it, obviously, because it's dangerous. They can't just shoot on sight. But they accomplish it. One guy dies, so they're all pretty upset about that. And then because they did it, the colonel orders them to do it again the next night. Same plan and everything. And obviously they're all really frustrated, and Winters tells them to all go get a good night of sleep, and essentially disobeys the order. And he just says that we're going to pretend like you guys went and couldn't capture any Germans alive. And they get pulled from the front line like the next day. So he knew it was just going to be a waste of lives. And apparently he claims that this is how it actually happened. I didn't do too much deep diving, but that's pretty crazy and good for him. So episode 9 is essentially the Holocaust episode, where they find a concentration camp and relieve the people from it, or help the people from there, because Germany started pulling back their soldiers. So they abandoned the concentration camps. Essentially, it sounds like killed as many Jews as they could on the way out, and then just locked them in there and left. This one focuses a lot on Nixon, who's been demoted for his drinking. And he's just kind of scrounging for whiskey until they find this camp. And apparently all the local Germans, and you see this throughout the episode because they're in Germany, they're all like, oh, it's amazing. We've been all over the country and we haven't found a single Nazi. Like, no one wants to be associated with it now that they're about to lose. So when they find this camp, there's a town nearby, and the colonel gives the order that every able-bodied person between 14 and 80 from the locals is essentially going to help bury all the bodies. So they have to come see it, which, is pragmatic and kind of messed up both. Obviously, all these scenes are pretty emotional. Holocaust stuff is always hard to see. And it's almost kind of like cheating. It's like when you give a kid cancer or something, or kill a dog, like it's always going to be emotional. And that's kind of how this episode is. Like, you see it, it's pretty gruesome. They didn't know about it. So when they show up, it's like, wow, they had no idea what was even going on. And then there's actually a pretty good part, like even by World War II Holocaust movie standards, where they let all the people in the concentration camp out, but then they're like, hey, if we feed them too fast, they're going to die. And we also don't have anywhere to take them. So you need to tell them to get back in the camp so they can be treated, medically and whatever. And the U.S. soldiers end up kind of looking just like the German ones with their guns and kind of forcing them back in there so they can take care of them. But I'm sure that's not very much solace for the people who have to go back in there. And we also find out that Hitler died. Like, Nixon just comes up and is like, hey, Hitler's dead, killed himself. And there's not like any build up or drama. It's just kind of how it happened, which I think is the right choice for a show like this, to not try to be, dramatic and build it up and all that. Because if you're one of these guys, that probably is how it happened. They probably just got a phone call and was like, hey, he's dead. Kind of need to wrap things up now. And also this episode, you get that Nixon's life is falling apart. His wife's leaving him, taking the kid and dog and everything. He's been demoted because he's been drinking. It's just one of those sacrifices from the front lines you don't really see in movies or anything like that. Maybe Jarhead. But, in general, this is kind of the reality of the situation, like the toll that the war took on the guys who were over there. And this episode is kind of the one wrapping it up. They're being told they're going to train for Okinawa because that was still going on at this point. And they're all kind of bitching because a lot of them don't have enough service points to honorably discharge, even though they've all been through D-Day and whatever battles and fought for months or, a year. It doesn't matter because the paperwork and the bureaucracy, essentially. So they're all going to get stuck going to Okinawa. And Winters actually volunteers to go and kind of wants to get started early. He's a major now, and he gets denied. They're like, no, your men have earned the right to keep you around, essentially. And you get to see him mess around with the Eagle's Nest and kind of working with the Germans. There is a pretty brutal part in here where they go find this guy who was an officer or a soldier. And Webster is trying to be like, hey, he might not have been one of the bad ones. He might have just been a guy doing his job. But the Jewish guy and another guy are like, don't care. And they shoot him. And, it's kind of unclear whether or not you're supposed to support that or understand it, or if that's just kind of how shit happens. There's also a couple of terrible parts where this guy facing the camera shoots this guy on guard duty because they're checking people who are driving through the area. And then you have another guy die in a fucking car crash. All these guys that had 75 points, but they needed 85 to leave. So they were stuck there kind of on this bullshit work and end up dying for no real reason. And the war in Okinawa obviously ends when Japan formally surrenders after the atomic bombs. And all these guys are like finally getting to go home. And it's kind of crazy because they do the thing where they talk about what happened to each guy. Some of them just died randomly in car accidents or in the ocean. Some lived full lives. But a lot of them just went back to being like normal guys. They went and did carpentry or labor or worked on a train or whatever the case was. And it kind of does put into perspective that as crazy as all the stuff that they went through and did was and how brave they were, at the end of the day, they were just normal kids. I feel like that's kind of the takeaway here with the ending, the way it's done. And then at the end here, you finally get the names to match the faces. And yeah, it's over. Yeah, really good show. Another good recommendation from the members. Of course, I know him in real life. He's a bitch. He probably won't even make it to this point in the video, so he can suck it. But yeah, not really too much to say about this. I spoke for half an hour. I'm not going to edit this one because I wanted it just to be more of a natural one. But I'm going to leave it there. If there's something you want me to review and watch, become a member. It's in the description. If you've seen the show, let me know what you think in the comments. I'll try to respond. And obviously, I'm not military, so maybe military people could draw different things out of it than I did. But yeah, really good show. You guys are on a roll. If you're still here, like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.